For what reason does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Keating of Massachusetts.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill gives the impression that we're going to deal with this issue in 5 years. If you look at the bill carefully, you'll find out, Mr. Speaker, that indeed what it could postpone is the effect of this amendment forever. And in fact, in terms of pollution, in terms of toxins, this is the equivalent of the pollution road to nowhere, where there's no ending in sight, none that'll ever be reached, and it's just nothing but a guise for the people to think they're doing something within the 5-year time frame. Now, my amendment would allow the 5 years, but it would be a maximum of 5 years before the source has to be implemented and the appropriate changes are met in terms of emissions. Now, what else would this amendment do? This amendment would save 10,000 related deaths, avert 6,000 heart attacks, avoid nearly 70,000 asthma attacks, and the pollution reductions required in this rule would cut mercury emissions from cement kilns by over 90%. And as all of us know, Mr. Speaker, mercury is a poisonous substance that affects the ability of infants and children to learn and to think. It also results in birth defects and cognitive disabilities. Cement kilns emit lead and arsenic, which cause cancer and damage to the nervous system. Now, let's line up the costs and benefits. The costs: birth defects, cognitive disabilities, cancer, heart attacks, asthma, attacks on the nervous system on one side of the ledger. The other side of the ledger are marginal savings by the companies for not doing what they really should be doing in terms of keeping people safe. Now, let's add up the cost of that versus the cost of all those ailments, all those things that affect young people, that will affect taxpayers funding this for decades to come. A multiple of whatever savings is there for the industries that are in question. So I hope this amendment passes. I think what this attempts to do is say, let's cut through the guile. If you mean 5 years, you mean 5 years. And so we should be in agreement on this if that is indeed the case. And I hope this amendment gets the support from my colleagues that believe 5 years is a reasonable time.
The gentleman yields back. For what reason does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
The amendment offered by the gentleman would set a 3-year compliance date and allow case-by-case extensions for up to 2 years if the administrator of EPA determines that there is a compelling need to do so. The purpose, of course, of this legislation is to protect health, provide feasibility and regulatory certainty, protect jobs, and minimize plant shutdowns. Under the Clean Air Act, sources already have 3 years to comply with Section 112 standards for cement kilns, with a potential 1-year extension by the EPA administrator or a state permitting authority. This amendment would allow for a second possible 1-year extension, so a source might be able to get 5 years for compliance. The amendment would impose additional regulatory burdens on both EPA and those facilities trying to comply. It would require a facility to compile evidence to justify the need for an additional year, and would require the administrator to make a case-by-case determination about whether that justification is compelling. All of the testimony in the hearings on this indicated that the current 3-year compliance time frame is simply not workable, and a definitive period of at least 5 years is needed. And so for that reason, with all due respect, we would urge the defeat of the gentleman's amendment.
Yields back. For what reason does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the pending amendment, and I want to yield to the author of the amendment.
The gentleman from
Mr.
California
Keating.
is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'd just say this. When you're talking about certainty, the only thing that is certain about this bill is there's no end to it. So if you call certainty meaning there's no time frame that can ever be reached for certain, then I don't understand the paradox. And when you're talking about the cost to the EPA and the marginal cost that might be there to the industry in terms of savings, that pales in comparison by multiples of the cost that taxpayers are going to have to pay for the cognitive disabilities, the birth defects of infants and young children that will be borne, in most cases, by the taxpayer because we're not making these industries do what they're supposed to do. With that, I yield back my time and thank
you.
my colleagues.
I want to reclaim my time because the gentleman's absolutely correct. There's no end point to when there will be a compliance so that we can get the health benefits because of that compliance. But let's go through the bill again. The bill would nullify EPA's emission standards for cement kilns. It ensures that if EPA is able to issue a new standard, the new standard would be less protective of public health and more protective of the cement manufacturer's profits. And even then, the bill allows for implementation of any new standards to be indefinitely delayed. It blocks EPA from requiring cement kilns to comply with the new rules for at least 5 years and fails to establish any deadline for compliance whatsoever. This could allow cement kilns to continue to pollute without limit indefinitely. I support this amendment because it would use this existing framework of the bill as a baseline for compliance, but it would also allow the administrator to provide additional extensions of 1 year for existing sources if she determines there is a compelling reason. No polluter could have more than 5 years to comply. Already under the Clean Air Act, every facility has complied no later than 3 years after the limits go into effect. Over the past 20 years, tens of thousands of sources across about 100 industries have cleaned up their toxic air pollution within that 3-year period. I think the statutory time frame is sufficient, but 5 years is a long time to wait for the communities living in the shadow of these cement kilns. At least this amendment sets an outer bound for when cement kilns will have to comply, unlike the underlying legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
The gentleman yields back.